Cardinal News is telling the little-known stories of Virginia's role in our country's march to independence. As we head toward America's 250th anniversary, we'll examine the events, people, and places that shaped the Commonwealth and the nation. Together we can better understand the role of our ancestors beyond what's in the history books. This is Cardinal 250, made possible in part by funding from the Virginia American Revolution 250 Commission.
What is your image of the Founding Fathers? If you picture old men in powdered wigs, you're not alone, but you're not accurate either. We're talking about misconceptions about age during the Revolutionary period with our guest, James Madison University professor Rebecca Brannon. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, excited to have you here. Today's conversation on the Cardinal News 250 podcast is a great companion to the Cardinal News 250 newsletter, and in particular, an article contributed by journalist Randy Walker for this edition. Read it and sign up for the 250 newsletter at our free website, cardinalnews.org. So, Rebecca, I'm super interested in this topic in general. And let's get right to it with how Randy starts his piece about our perceptions about the ages of like Jefferson and Washington, Patrick Henry, and more. We always picture them as, elder statesmen. Is that accurate when we're talking about the revolutionary time itself?
It's not, but because they were all painted long after the events of the revolution, after they'd won and were successful instead of being hanged, we have this image of them as old men because those are what a lot of the portraits portray. But in fact, revolutions are a young man's game. Yeah. And most, not all, but most of them were anywhere from their late teens, like the Marquis de Lafayette, who was like an 18-year-old puppy, basically, when you read all the descriptions. And even George Washington was the middle-aged man with military and political experience in his 40s. And then there's only a few who are sort of genuinely older when they're participating in the American Revolution, like Benjamin Franklin, who sort of plays up his grandfatherliness at times.
Yeah. Before we go any further on this, I'm fascinated to know how you became sort of interested in this particular aspect of history. You're a history professor, correct?
I am a history professor, and my specialty is the American Revolution, so I'm excited for the 250th.
Yeah. So, but how this topic of age and what we think of, like how we're remembering this and how we sort of paint this picture in our mind is really interesting to me. How did you come to focus in on that and do some work and research on that?
Well, my first book is about American loyalists, and it's about the American loyalists who stayed in the United States even though they lost the revolution. So I'm always attracted to topics that are sort of there but overlooked. And I'm always attracted to topics that help us measure the American Revolution's consequences. So I measured, did loyalists still have a place in the United States, even though they hadn't supported the political ideals as expressed in 1776? And with this topic, I was interested in whether the American Revolution changed the way ordinary people live in a lot of ways, and whether old age might turn out to be one of those ways. But I'm sure it was also influenced. We historians are influenced by our own times to ask different questions of the past. And I'm sure I was influenced by watching my own parents get older. I had a grandmother who died just a few years ago at 105. And so I was living this experience that so many of us are in the 21st century of aging parents and grandparents, and what does aging look like now? And I was interested in what it looked like in the past. And that's where it started. And because I'm a historian of the American Revolution, I started with the revolutionaries.
Yeah. So let's set the context then of that time. Let's talk about life expectancy in general in those times. What was it? Obviously, today it's different. You just referenced your late grandmother living to be such an old age at 105, did you say?
Yes.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's not our typical life expectancy now, but draw the contrast for us between these two times.
So It's a little deceptive because life expectancy at birth in the 18th century is absolutely horrible. One of the reasons it's so terrible is so many children die before the age of 5. So if you ask what your life expectancy at birth was then, it's truly awful. If, however, you make it to 20 in the 18th century, in other words, you make it past all the childhood diseases and accidents that carried people off, your chances of living to 60 or a little past 60 are as good as 1 in 2, right? Most people will make it to close to 60. Not everybody, but a lot of people will. It's more unusual to live into your 80s and 90s, but famously people did. In fact, Thomas Jefferson died in his 80s. John Adams lived into his 90s. They, at the time, were regarded as somewhat lucky, having achieved an unusual but hardly remarkable or unheard of long life.
Yeah. When you ask your students about this, when you venture into this topic to your students, what are their perceptions? And I think I probably know because I think we all have them. What are they?
Well, yeah. First of all, they're like, didn't everybody die young?
Yeah.
2, and I didn't touch on this, didn't like lots of women die in childbirth, and so the only old people around would be men. Well, women did die in childbirth. But again, if you survived childbirth, and while every woman probably knew a woman who died in childbirth, that certainly wasn't every woman's fate. Women still lived longer. I went in this thinking men lived longer than women in the 18th century, and it's only today that women live longer than men on average, but that's not true. Women lived longer on average in the 18th century too. And they kind of knew that and understood that women's general longevity was longer.
So let's talk about the quality of life then, given just what a different time it was then. You mentioned some of the specific ages of some of the names we tend to come up with more easily when we think about revolutionary history, that Ben Franklin was, what did you say, 70, 71-ish at the time of the revolution?
Yes, he was in his 70s when he's the old man revolutionary who flirts and his way through Paris, taking it by storm and securing a crucial alliance. What kind of life was it with regards to how healthy you would be at that time if you were in your 40s versus up to 70? Because you mentioned if you made it to 20 and you survived all the childhood illnesses. I think that's a really great point to lay that out. So then what happens after that? Today we have this world that and this culture, especially here, about wellness and longevity and being active on purpose and, being careful what we eat and drink. What was it like then? They are obsessed with achieving longevity too, and in many of the same ways we are. And we're obsessed with those because they were. So they're actually the first moderns, the people who adopt the Enlightenment in the 18th century. And they believe, yes, you can exercise your way to good health. And at the beginning of the 18th century, exercise is something for poor people who don't have jobs of leisure and can't avoid hard work. And by the end of the 18th century, exercise is something that good men and women do because it's part of making sure that you're healthy for as long as possible. And it's incumbent on you, and they come to believe, like we do, that maybe you can overcome any kind of bad luck in health if you just exercise hard enough and eat carefully enough.
Right. Although that wasn't true.
It wasn't true. It's not necessarily true for us either. But some of the things they suggest that people do will sound really familiar. So eat less, eat moderately, eat a more vegetable forward or vegetarian diet are common prescriptions. If you measure them sort of calorically, some of them are essentially moderate eating. Some of them are true calorie limitation diets, which people try today. There are mouse studies that suggest if you feed mice 1/3 fewer calories than their daily average needs for a long period, they live longer. If you ask me, this sounds like a recipe for misery, but people are trying it. And there are some in the 17th and 18th century who are trying this too. They believe in exercise, but it's not like they go to the gym. But Benjamin Franklin actually believes in weightlifting. The rest of them essentially believe in moderate cardio. They believe in walking, walking through your garden if that's the only place you can get out when you're older, but walking, riding horses. If you can't manage that, then maybe you should, if you can't manage that, maybe you should at least take a ride in a carriage. So we kind of call that all cardio, but Benjamin Franklin thinks you should weightlift, and he's got kettlebells, and he, into his 70s, is practicing with kettlebells to maintain his muscles.
That's fascinating. I don't think a lot of people probably realize how long kettlebells have been around.
Exactly.
That's so interesting.
Picture Benjamin Franklin working out with them, and he does it, so he sort of throws it between his legs and up in the air.
Yeah. So just like today, the people who make decisions about actual combat and actual, taking aggressive actions are generally not the people doing that on the ground. The actual fighting in the Revolutionary War was done by the young. Talk to me about that. If it was so hard to get to 20 at that time, how did we have people available to do that, to be healthy enough to actually go into battle and get this done?
War has always been a young man's game for the cannon fodder, and it was certainly true in the Revolution. And one answer is birth rates were much higher in the 18th century, and early Americans celebrated fertility and celebrated big families. And there's actually the peak of American births per woman as a sort of, compared to the population, was actually in the 1750s and 1760s. So those children who were born are, lo and behold, in their late teens, just in time to be soldiers for the American Revolution. And they're this bumper crop of American babies. Interestingly, birth rates start to drop in the wake of the American Revolution. And there's a really interesting historical study that suggests birth rates start dropping in the United States long before people live longer or are more likely to live past childhood, but birth rates start dropping because women start valuing their time and don't want to, and their families see child rearing as not the project of their whole life, but as the project of part of your lifespan, and that birth rates start dropping in the United States.
So
even kids still die.
Yeah. You strike me as someone who is excited about history and excited about talking about history. I want to ask you, because you are right there in a college setting and you're dealing with young people, why does it matter with regards to this topic in particular, whether or not we're right about the age of our founding fathers? And tell me, like, what gets you fired up to set the record straight, if you will, and to talk to students about things like this today with everything students have at their disposal?
Well, several reasons. Yeah. As you say, we all have this mental image of the elderly founders, which plays in an odd way with the fact that we have a lot of older people wielding power in politics today. And I think it's important to paint for young people. It hasn't always been that way. It is unlikely to always be that way in the future. And that there are periods of time where young people seize control of politics, like in the American Revolution. And I think it's also important, by talking about the realities of aging in the past, often using famous people they're interested in, like at my university, James Madison, helps humanize the leaders of the past. And, they were presidents, they were writers of the Constitution, in Madison's case. But to paint an idea that there's not some deus ex machina that comes down and gives us the perfect leader, sort of untouched by time and life, that real people seize control and make the world different and better. And that therefore, you don't have to be perfect to be a leader either.
It's so interesting. What kind of response do you get from your students? Now, do you teach some general ed, like as part of what you teach, something that's required for most students?
Absolutely. I teach the U.S. History Survey. I'll be starting again in a week.
Okay, so what kind of response do you get? I mean, my point is just that some people, I'm sure, are on fire when they're in your class because it really gets them excited and they understand that we're really just talking about people. Like throughout time and history, whatever event you're talking about, it all boils down to people. But then other students maybe aren't as tuned in or excited about it. How do you try to make it relevant? You've talked about it some here, but tell me, how do you try to reach people? Are you talking to hundreds of kids at one time, by the way? I say kids.
Oh, yeah.
They're kids to us.
150
Okay.
times.
So how do you, how does that go in today's world and all the, they have so many things at their disposal, as I mentioned earlier. How do you find that teaching college history and to a large group of college students now?
It keeps you on your tab, yes. And yes, they don't all want to be there, and I understand that. The first thing is I try to break down, if they don't like history, and many people don't, it also often has to do with the sense that high school history asks them about names, dates, and places in multiple choice tests. But I'm always like, well, that's not what professional historians do. History is about a way of thinking using the evidence of the past. And we're interested in people and why people did the interesting things they did. So I spend a certain amount of time just trying to set the goals of what history is and how I'm not just going to test them on dates. In fact, I'm almost never going to test them on dates. I also find that I try to tell history in stories and try to bring evidence into the classroom, even into the large lecture hall. We talk about paintings and have them analyze paintings, which is good for waking up in the morning and thinking, and also good for showing them, maybe in high school you read a textbook, that this is actually how we know what we know, right? We have to look at the evidence of the past. And the last thing, since you asked, is I try to use new technology in addition to storytelling to keep them on their toes and keep them awake and engaged in class. So we have polling software that we can use now. So I can ask them questions and I can do everything from, okay, so I've been talking for 10 minutes. So here's a multiple choice question you'll get right if you were listening. To, I've done things, this is out of today's topics, but I've done things where, for instance, I've been teaching about the concept of the New Deal in the United States and the New Deal for the American people. And what was that? And what did it mean to be guaranteed the dignity of a wage you could support your family on and not to be afraid of starvation? And then I ask them in real time to write 2 sentences about what would the New Deal be today? Like what would have to be in it for it to be meaningful in our time? Yeah. And then it can show all their responses on the board, and Reddit style, they can vote on each other's responses. And so you can see the most popular ones rising to the top of the screen. And it allows us to have a little bit of a conversation, even with 150 people, and even including students who are too shy to ever raise their hands and talk in front of 149 other students. But this way we can incorporate a little thinking and talking into our class.
Very cool. Before we started recording for the podcast, I mentioned to you that when I was quote unquote researching you and looking more into what you do and what you've done, I came across a website. Oh, shoot. And I can't remember the exact name, so you'll have to correct me. But it was something to the effect of Women Love History Too, or something like that.
Women Also Know History.
Okay. womenalsoknowhistory.com.org.
That sounds right.
Okay. So what is that all about? There's a website for everything, by the way. Now you can find anything.
There's a website for all.
I was fascinated by it. So tell me about that.
So it kind of started with a comment several years ago on Twitter of somebody who was spouting off, as people do on Twitter, and saying, all of this stuff, only men are really interested in history. Well, that's just not true. And so that's where the first part of the response, women also know history, that there are a lot of women who love history, and there are a lot of women who are professional historians as well. But the second part was this sense that, journalists and the public is looking for history, and they're looking for people to know something about it, to talk about it. But that a lot of big journalistic organizations are going to go to the usual sources, and that's going to end up with them mostly speaking to male historians. So how do we get the voices of women in history out there? And by doing so, make for a more interesting story, get our own voices out there, and make the point that there are plenty of nerdy women like me who love history.
Yeah.
And that's how the website started. And it was a place for us to all put up what we do and what we can talk about, to try to make for a more interesting conversation for the public.
That's so interesting. That actually fits right in with the Cardinal News 250 project, which is, the things we're doing. We're trying to shine a light on the things that people haven't heard about, the groups of people that don't get as much play in the history books. We grew up, I'm of a certain age, and it was a pretty defined thing that you were going to read about, hear about, and have to learn and have to memorize, as you were referencing earlier, certain dates, certain people, certain names. And it's pretty limited when you consider that there were a lot more people who influenced what happened during the Revolutionary War. And of course, we're specifically focusing on Virginia and just the little known people who have been, who were effective at that time. And so anyway, I really appreciate your time today. Is there any other thought you'd like to leave us with? Or Cardinal
Actually, just the point about exercise, but another thing I'm finding is the things that the founders didn't always want to talk about, that you find in some letters and not others, that aging is hard, and it was hard for them. And they were often trying to decide how much to share with their friends, because sharing your burdens with your friends in letters can be enormously uplifting, and how much to hide about their struggles so that only the people in their household knew about the struggles of aging. And their family members often don't want to put things into letters. So you'll find it sometimes offhand to another family member, sometimes not. But things I found about the difficulties of aging and of caring for aging people. So Benjamin Franklin, late in life, is bedbound. And his daughter is busy running his household and taking care of everything for him. But she can't physically do the work. He's still an adult man, and she can't physically lift his body safely. So his grandsons are dashing in and out of the house to do the physical care of lifting Benjamin Franklin out of his bed, getting him to the toilet if he needs to, getting him to a chair if he's going to sit there for several hours. And although they didn't talk about it much in medical manuals, they were aware, and ordinary people were aware of the possibility of bed sores if you didn't move people in bed. And so even if they're what we would understand as bedbound, they're making sure they're moving their family member around and changing sheets sometimes, and, trying to find out things about how people were actually cared for, and discovering, right, that things they don't always want to talk about, like lifting them in and out of bed. And this is how Benjamin Franklin's body is being handled when he's at his most vulnerable. And of course, he doesn't want to write about this in letters. It makes sense to me.
Right.
But as a historian, I want to recover the past.
Well, and we're all just people at the end of the day, and technology has been amazing. We're this far forward, so to speak, but at the end of the day, you can't escape being human, and these are the very real, everyday experiences that we all go through. So I think I would love your history class, Rebecca, because I want to hear that stuff. We're all, instead of the dry sort of official narrative, it's exciting, everything that happened then. And I don't mean to paint it as not exciting, but it's the human everyday experiences that I think are the most interesting. So I think your students are lucky if you're really trying to, bring that right to the forefront like that.
Well, thank you. Tell them that. Get in my class. You're lucky to be
I
here.
will. I'll just tell me when and where. But anyway, thank you so much for your time today and for the conversation.
Thank you.
And I want to thank everyone for listening to Cardinal News 250, this podcast. Thank you to Rebecca Brannon, a professor at James Madison University. Thanks also to Andy Depew and all of our friends at Blue Ridge PBS for their assistance. This project is made possible in part by funding from the Virginia American Revolution 250 Commission. And don't forget, you can get the Cardinal 250 newsletter, all of our free website news and newsletters at cardinalnews.org. I'm Dutchie Jessee.
Thanks for listening to Cardinal 250, made possible in part by funding from the Virginia American Revolution 250 Commission. For more information on Cardinal News 250, including the Cardinal 250 and other newsletters, visit cardinalnews.org.